Hey everyone, Hashi here, and over the next little while I'm going to be releasing a series of tutorials inspired by Game of Thrones.
Nice, sounds awesome. Do you think you can have it done before the show is done? So that, when people are still watching it?
Sorry, what was that? No, you're breaking up. Hashi, breaking up.
Now, I'll do my best to not blatantly spoil stuff, but we're obviously going to be visually exploring elements that take place throughout the run of the show. And whether you love the series or it wasn't your cup of tea, you have to marvel at how impressive it is that a TV show and its visual effects tackled dragons and battles and hordes of undead zombies battling on a frozen lake being attacked by dragons. I mean, Game of Thrones was an ambitious show whose later seasons delivered some of the best visual explorations of classical fantasy tropes we've ever seen on screen. Watching the show from a visual effects standpoint is a great overview of small and scrappy effects, all the way to full-on technical wizardry, combined with a thoughtful consideration to practical elements. We're covering a lot of ground as always, so this time I'm breaking up the tutorial into 4 separate, more digestible videos. So stay tuned, subscribe, and we'll cover all of this stuff in the weeks to come. As you may know, Red Giant has just released VFX Suite, a great collection of helpful tools which I'm going to be employing a lot throughout the next few installments. Now, this isn't just because I was asked to. I'm a lazy man by nature, and I fear change. So I'm going to show you how I use the VFX Suite, primarily to save myself time, and also access tools right inside After Effects that are so fast and helpful, I really can't imagine not using them now. Now, there's lots of information on these tools individually right here on the channel, so if any of them pique your interest, please check them out. As we get into this song of fire and ice, it'd probably be great to have some fire and/or ice. So I'd love to tell you guys about another invaluable resource I used in putting together these episodes. Action VFX. Action VFX is a massive online resource for stock footage, ranging from fire and explosions to snow and dust, ground cracks and simulations, all very quickly browsable and very affordable. I'd like you guys to meet a few of my friends.
So I have like this $30,000 camera just under this burning ceiling.
Just waiting for it to collapse.
Yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Woodolph Pierre-Louis, and I'm the founder and CEO.
And my name is Luke Thompson, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer.
We blow things up and help you put them in your movies. In 2011, back when I was in college, that was when I kind of was selling stuff online. Obviously nothing as crazy as what Action VFX is doing now. Did one shoot in Chicago. That was the first official Action VFX shoot. Didn't really go that well, honestly. It's like, to put it lightly, and it was just one of those things where we quickly, and if we want to keep this project going and do it as well as we want to do it for the users, then we're going to have to raise a lot more money and actually redo a lot of these effects. And so that's when we did the Kickstarter back in the end of 2015. Which ended up being like a huge success. Well, like 400 backers, which were mostly just VFX artists and stuff that really saw the need of what we're trying to do as far as creating this.
You think, oh man, shooting explosions all the time, that must just be super fun. And it is super fun, but like it's still work, and we still want to make sure that like everything's going well.
It's like I always say that my favorite assets and my favorite assets to film are 2 very different things, because it's like something may come out and it's great, but when you think of filming it, it's just, man, this was the most stressful thing in the world. Doing our best to push the envelope, because like obviously we want really high quality effects, but we also really want the quantity. To be that place that literally would have everything you can think of. So we live off people's suggestions, because essentially we want to do something that the VFX community actually wants. So we're very receptive to that.
Honestly, the Red Giant tools that we've been able to incorporate in our pipeline and stuff have been a huge lifesaver as well. So we work really well together.
No, that is for sure.
Now, if you're a visual effects compositor or even an editor, you'll likely find exactly what you need, pre-keyed and ready to drop into your film, or commercial, or game. The stuff is really beautiful, and we are super happy to partner with these guys for this video. For all of these effect shots, we needed some awesome live action plates, so we teamed up with some dangerously talented fight performers trained by Ronan Trainer from the UK's independent drama. Thank you to them, Mookie International, and our very own Martis Vatek for putting in some crazy hard work for this footage, some of which we're going to share with you, my friends. Let's start with a little magic. I've got a few pieces of lovely green screen footage here of a sorceress using some magic to conjure a fireball. And one thing that's pretty important to discuss when you're shooting on a green screen is the lighting setup. It's important to have your practical elements representing what you think the lighting will resemble in the final comp. For this, we tried dangling a shielded light bulb in front of her face for this shot, but it didn't exactly work out. So instead we flickered some other light in front of her for some interactive light from this fireball. In this wide shot, we knew she'd be mostly silhouetted by flames, so we've got a strong backlight going on. The first important step here, and in all of our subsequent videos, is keying out our actors. And this job was made even easier by our latest installment of Primatte Keyer. Once I apply Primatte, I usually start by trying the Auto button. Auto does a pretty great job of guessing what color you're trying to key and giving you a great result on the first try. If it doesn't work, you can always manually sample your background. Either way, after this I always suggest soloing your footage and changing the comp view to alpha, right here. Switching to this view allows me to see what little bits of my screen are left over or what little bits of my subject might be missing. One of my new favorite features in Primatte 6 is down here, called Core Matte. A lot of the time in green screen work, I do a key which gives me a pretty great edge, but then it has little holes inside the character. Sometimes trying to refine those holes sacrifices your edge quality, so the workaround that many of us use is creating a duplicate of your keyed layer and then using a combination of chokers to preserve the solid interior of a subject. You can then combine these mattes to get a better key. So we thought, why not just save the hassle and create a checkbox which adds the core matte shape right into your alpha result. There are some refinement tools right below to assist with whatever scale your subject is. Time saved. I'm going to be using that technique lots through this series, so enjoy. Now, this lady ought to be out in the woods or something, so I've grabbed this free image from, I'm going to say, Pixier? By Mako Machine. Now, I could probably just use the still image, but to liven it up a bit, I'm going to do some multiplaning in After Effects. Multiplaning, or 2.5D, whatever you want to call it, is the process of taking a photograph and simulating depth via a camera move. Now, when you're doing this kind of work, Photoshop and its content-aware tools have made this process a lot easier over the years. But for now, I'm just going to do something really quick and dirty. So first I got to prep my layers. So I'll mask out this foreground tree, then maybe use the extract effect to isolate some of these darker branches to add back in. And then next, on another layer, I'll clone stamp out the foreground tree, and then start masking out the midground. Then on the far background, I clone out all of this foreground stuff, and I'm left with 3 layers, which I can render out as PNGs with alpha channels. In a new comp, it's easy to convert these layers to 3D layers, pushing the background back, pulling the foreground forward, and doing a trick that I've mentioned before of adjusting the anchor point to like here, and then effectively folding that layer, so we get a bit of Z depth out of this part right here. Now the alpha channel here kind of gives the effect away, so I'm going to mask out the top of that layer. So now that that's set up, I have a 3D-ish background, which I can add a subtle bit of movement to the camera to. Also, now that I've cut out some of these tree elements, I can rearrange the layers and create different kind of background looks, just for some shot variety out of one photo. So let's combine one of these backgrounds with my medium close-up of Our Lady, casting her fire spell or whatever. Now here's a preview of those 2 layers together, so you can kind of see that the camera movement's subtle enough it doesn't really betray that that green screen shot is static. Now obviously I haven't done any kind of integration between these 2 elements, so it looks bad. But I want to lay out everything in the shot before I start blindly color correcting along the way. Now it's time to start adding some delightful assets from Action VFX. Now as a reminder, they have a collection of free stuff that you could get started with right now. Everything on their site is organized by type of asset. There's also a whole category called Atmosphere, which I'm going to use a lot over this series. For example, there's some great hovering fog that might look great in the background of that comp. So I'll bring it in, set it as a 3D layer, and throw it into the scene. I'll switch to the screen blending mode so I can see it on top of the background. And now I can see I've got some weird intersection issues as I bring this fog layer in. They quickly betray any illusion my 3D layers were kind of getting. So I'll make sure that my layer stack down here is in order from background to foreground elements. And then I can pop in an adjustment layer behind my fog to force the fog in front of everything below it. And out of habit, I'm also adding an adjustment layer on top too, which would shield it if any foreground elements happen to be rotated back into its space. Think of this adjustment layer sandwich as a way to force that layer to stay in front of these elements and behind these ones. Now, instead of sticking with the screen blending mode, I'll actually set my layer back to normal and then apply the set matte effect, using this layer's own luminance as a matte. Now, this is called unmulting in my day, but apparently unmult is being phased out. In any case, this is helpful because fog and smoke don't always necessarily brighten the background. Sometimes comping with smoke and fire or using only the additive blending modes can make a whole comp too bright or washed out. With the set matte effect, I can add a fill color to fill those pixels with like a slightly grayish blue color so they match this set better. Or I could have tinted it as well. So as you can see, it's always nice to add in some practical elements when possible. To create a magic fireball, I want to mix some practical elements with some particle effects. I'm going to start with the particle effects because I think that they'll be a little bit more customizable. Let's start with a new solid, then I'll apply an instance of particular. I really love some of the effects the fluid dynamic system can produce, so I'm going to start with a very basic setup. For emitter type, I'll select sphere, shrink the radius down a bit. Next I'll go over to color, where I can select one of the preset blocks called fire. And then I can go over to my physics block and select fluid. And we've already got something that looks kind of neat. Let's apply this setting for now. And next let's animate the origin of these particles. I'll create a new null, and then I'm going to use one of my favorite old features of After Effects, Motion Sketch. In case you don't know about it or haven't thought about Motion Sketch in a very long time, what it basically does is allow you to record yourself dragging a layer around the screen, and it saves that data as a motion path. I know I want this fiery thing to kind of hover around in a little swirly motion and then shoot out a frame like this. So there we go. I can press P to reveal those position keyframes, and then down here on the timeline, I'll use an expression to link my particular emitter's position to that null. Now if I play through, I can see some pretty good stuff happening here. But the whole thing's a little misaligned since I was motion sketching without a preview. No problem though. If I select all of my keyframes, I can now go select one of them and transform the whole path until it's where I want it to be. Also, while all these keys are selected, I can hold down Alt or Option and then click on the first or last keyframe and then drag it one way or the other to squeeze the keyframes together. I'll do it in this case to make it so the fireball exits a little bit earlier. Now, something you want to be aware of when you're squeezing or stretching out keyframes is that now these keyframes exist at fractions of frames instead of exact frame numbers. So something just to be aware of in case you get a weird error of two keyframes that seem like they're less than a frame apart. Let's focus on this moment when she casts the fire forward. I know the emitter leaves screen, but I would also love if there were a way to have these other hanging particles be affected too. And luckily, with fluid dynamics, this is all possible. Remember those vortex rings? They look really cool. We talked about them in Aquaman. One of the cool things I can do is jump into particular, add a new system that is emitting 0 particles, but simply contains a vortex ring, which will affect any of the particles within its radius. I can point this ring emitter towards screen left, and then add some keyframes to its strength to get something like this. So check it out, that's basically what I was going for. And just as I've said in previous episodes, particle systems are one of those things that you mess with, preview again until you like where they end up. By modifying and fine-tuning some of the physics settings, I wind up in a shape that I really like. So I can start seeing some better integration. I'm going to take a little moment to roto this foreground hand and sleeve. Now, I wouldn't always do it this way, but since her hand shape stays pretty similar throughout, I'm going to use a single mask and adjust it throughout. I'm going to pre-render my particular layer because I think I'm going to use a copy of it as a matte of sorts. On Action VFX, I found this great footage of some fire that looks like it's about the right size. So I'll bring that into After Effects and find a placement that has some good bits of flame right in the location of that magic fireball appearing. Now, if I were to just mask this in a circle area, even if I feathered it, I would get these really bad faded out edges, which don't look very convincing. So I'm going to go with a matte that I create using the render of my particular layer. Here's how. I'll solo this rendered layer for a moment, and then I'll add a bit of fast blur, and then crank up the curves. Now I have a much broader area that's still informed by the shape of those particular particles. Then I can extract the dark edges so I have a proper alpha on my layer. If I apply this as an alpha matte to that original piece of fire footage, you can see it's kind of a dynamic blob now. Now let me solo the matte layer again because I'm going to use some very similar techniques to what we learned in our Captain Marvel episode, where I take this basic flat edge and then I apply roughen edges. I'll set the type to spiky and then play with the settings to make the edge look more like flame. If I switch to the alpha view, you can see the shape alone. Very much like some of our tests in the Captain Marvel episode, I'll add a time-based expression to the noise offset to be upward and a little bit to the left over time. And I'll add another time expression to the evolution for even more life. Now if I reveal that matted layer, you can see the footage of the flame is being matted in a way that the original top edge of the flame is totally preserved, but these outer edges have more of a fractal approximation. Way better than a feathered mask, and also more driven by expressions and effects than any keyframing or masking. I can do a little bit more work on the edge sharpness and positioning of the stock flames, and the end result is very pretty. I go through and add a few more of the fireball assets from Action VFX to this moment where she casts the flame forward, doing a little masking and adjustment here and there. I'll also add an instance of Null Light Factory to give the fireball a little bit of pop. Now, because I know that this actor is going to be lit by fire in the front, and I guess by moonlight or something in the back, I know there's going to be some color disparity between the front half of her and the back half. So I'm going to pre-comp her layer and add a few adjustment layers. One's going to be this mask that kind of blue-grays her out in the back a bit. One is going to be just a little mask to darken the bottom of her costume right here. It's a little bit bright because of our practical light. And then the third is going to be an adjustment layer that I use that mask from my already rotoed hand to kind of take a little bit of the edge off of the highlight of this front hand. Then I'll futz with all of these settings until I like how all of these pieces are animating together. No, I didn't say they look good together yet. They're all just competent individual elements. We've got a pretty great multiplane foggy background, nicely keyed Lady Witch, and some pretty cool bits of fiery goodness. But now that I've got this very basic setup, we need a hero. And look!
Up in the sky! It's a bird!
It's a plane!
But what does it do?
Supercomp is a plugin that takes your layers and makes them look good together. There are some great overview videos on this channel all about the specifics, but today, and over the next few episodes, you guys can see a case study of how I use Supercomp. One of the first things I'm going to do is reduce this comp to just a few simple elements. The background and the sorceress are just fine right now, and aside from the lens flare, I'm going to throw all this fiery stuff together, so I'm just dealing with one layer called fiery stuff. Now I'm ready to activate Supercomp. I'll select these 4 layers, and then go to RG VFX Supercomp. And you'll see this pop-up appear, as well as a new solid at the very top of your comp called Supercomp. Supercomp is exporting everything to this single layer right now. In fact, you can see that if I go down here and turn off the other layers, everything is fine because all of them are being referenced by the Supercomp effect. Taking a quick look at our Supercomp window, it's basically like a mini compositor. It has the 4 layers that we added to it, our null, fiery stuff, sorceress, and background, all in a nice layer stack like this. Now this window can hover, or you could go ahead and dock it, just like this. Whatever's best for your workspace. Now you can see the layer stack represented right here, with intuitive buttons to turn each layer on and off. If I click on any of the layers, you can see them soloed in the Supercomp preview window. And if I click up here on the Supercomp block itself, it'll preview the whole thing. Now why use Supercomp? Well, check this out. There's this handy radial menu that has all of the most common effects that you would already use for compositing, like light wraps and layer glows, edge erosion, and edge blending kind of effects. All of them are built right in and easy to access. Let's start with the background. It's too bright right now. And so, really quickly from the radial menu, I can select color correction. This is basically a mini version of the interface from Colorista, which is amazing. So, really quickly, I could jump in here and do something like turn the exposure down, or adjust or tint any of the white points, things like that. Everything you'd want to do to color correct a layer. Alright, let's move on to our second layer, also too bright. Now, one handy feature in here is that we could copy and paste any effect we like, just like this. Now, obviously the killed exposure wasn't the right effect for this layer, so I'm going to bring that back up, but I'll mess around with some of the other levels and see where I end up. And you know, something like this is already looking a lot better, the whole comp. But that's just color correction, everybody does that. Let me show you some other cool stuff. Right now our sorceress is her own colors and the background is its own colors. There's no real interaction between the two, and we need a little bit more integration. So I'm going to go back to that radial menu and check out this effect called haze. Now at first it's pretty subtle, which is great. All of these default values are a good amount of subtle because you can crank them up, but honestly after the honeymoon period you're really going to start wanting to scale all these back to closer to default values anyway. So haze, let me turn this all the way up to 100% and show you what it's doing. Kind of like a light wrap in normal mode, it's taking the whole background and blurring that color through the layer. Haze has this cool property called shadow amount. And shadow basically kind of darkens the interior a bit, but leaves the edges a little bit brighter. It's still a very, very broad kind of light wrap. And of course you would never apply it at 100%. So let me show you what happens if this were turned down to something like 25. If you look out here at her hand or the back of her costume, you can see that the color of the background is bleeding through her level in a way that kind of hands one over to the other, which is pretty amazing. I'm going to tweak my color correction a little bit. It's really easy to do right here. And then I'm going to do something about how sharp things like her hand right here are. I'm going to add an edge blend. Now edge blend comes in appropriately subtly. This little white preview mask over here shows what area we're going to blend pixels together. It's the edge of her alpha. Now if I crank this up, you can see more obviously that it's blurring all the pixels right at the edge of her, blurring together the background and foreground colors. So overall looking better already. Let me show you a quick example of some of the things that Supercomp is doing that you may not realize right now. If I were to dive down into my background and play with the color correction a little bit, as I brighten the background, you can see that the color of that haze wrapping around her is changing. If I darken it all the way down, there's nothing really to wrap. And if I overexpose it, you can see that she's getting overcranked because of that background too. Now something that would feature more prominently if the background were bright like this is a light wrap, which of course is accessible right here. I can add a light wrap. I'll turn up the amount too high just so you guys can all see it. As you can check out in the preview window, it's showing just the effect of the light wrap on her layer, and over in our actual comp window you can see the whole comp together. Now what's fun about this is I can go right back to my background layer, adjust the color correction back down to about where it was, and this should look pretty great. Alright, enough about her. What about this fire up here? Now fire and glowing elements are one of the things I had the most fun with in Supercomp. I'll show you why. Supercomp mixes things together in different layer types. Now this fiery stuff layer came in as an additive layer, and that's because the original layer was set to an additive blending mode. But no matter what your layer type, right here in the radial menu over to the left, are presets. Now, almost everything I've done so far are common techniques, and it's really likely that there's a layer preset that already does exactly what I've said to do. What's cool about Supercomp is that it allows you to do a real-time preview in the preview window. As you hover over each of these presets, it's showing you up here what each of these presets looks like. I'm going to apply this one called Explosion Core. Now, over time, you'll get to know these icons. This one is a color correction. It's darkening the exposure a bit, I'm assuming so it can overcrank it a little bit with glow. The second one is Heat Blur. Now, whenever you composite fire into a scene, you're supposed to kind of blur the background behind it, because that's what fire does photographically to the things behind it. When Stu Maschwitz mentioned this obvious fact to Seth Worley and I, we definitely nodded along like we knew this the whole time. But anyway, Heat Blur does this automatically, using the Luma value from your layer to blur everything behind it in a realistic way. But this is more than a compound blur. You can also add texture and detail to the type of blur that's happening behind, and also use that same matte to drive displacement, which you can turn all the way up or down, soften it out, play with a bit. Like, look at this weird result. This is all happening because I have a fire layer and stuff behind it. Supercomp is applying this color correction, this glow, this distortion, and everything driven by just that fire layer that I had in there already. And this may not be appropriate for this comp, but maybe I like it, and I can right-click and save it as a preset, and then browse through some of the other presets that they have. Like, look at all these weird results that I can get just from the preset menu. I could even do weird stuff like mess with the hue and tint the fire to a different color. And look at this, all of the glow in the scene is now coming from the blue fire. And what's funny is that this is all taking longer to describe out loud than to actually do it. Let me show you an example. So let me revert all the way back to before we applied Supercomp. I select the 4 layers I want, Effect, Supercomp. In here we can color correct the background, select this widget, adjust a few points. There we go. Let's color correct this lady as well in a very similar manner. Then let's add some subtle haze with a higher shadow amount. Add the default edge blend, default light wrap. Yeah, looks good. And on fiery stuff, let's choose a preset. Let's go with, I think Explosion Core was the one I liked earlier. But I'm gonna play with the displacement settings a bit and boost that glow a little as well. We'll color correct our null light factory layer just to give it a little bit more punch in the center. And I mean, that's basically it. And granted, I knew what I was doing ahead of time, but really, once you're familiar with all of these different widgets, they're very quick to apply, and you can see the results in very close to real time. When we were working on the demo videos for this, one of the things I found myself always doing was adding an adjustment layer above Supercomp and throwing on an instance of Mojo. And just like in many other instances of my work before, I would also add Renoiser. As an additional last touch, I grabbed a foreground fog asset from Action VFX, and also a slight blue gradient coming from the top right. I'm going to quickly cover our second shot, which has many of the exact same elements as the first. We've got the green screen footage. I'll draw a simple mask around it to avoid the production equipment. Run Primatte Keyer on it. The auto button gives me a pretty great result on this one, though there are a few little parts that need a little bit of cleanup. Once I've sorted through that, I jump to that background that I created for the shot 2 and create some camera keyframes to create this slight drift into my scene. I stick with a pretty subtle camera movement so I don't have to modify my footage of the sorceress. Once I put these two pre-comps together, I decide to add the VFX Shadow effect to my sorceress layer. Shadow is super intuitive. It creates this little T of sorts, where you can adjust the ground plane via these two, just like that, and then grab the direction and point it wherever you like. So with this, I'm simulating a bit of a cast shadow from a fire I'm going to comp in front of her. Next, let's add that fire. Again, Action VFX has our back. To animate and kind of angle this fire in place in this scene, I'm actually going to use CC Power Pin and just animate some points at the beginning and at the end to adjust the fire to the right size that I want. I'm using Power Pin to adjust the perspective instead of using a 3D layer, because in the render engine for the current After Effects, 3D objects are rendered later and therefore not picked up by Supercomp properly, though we're excited to try to include this in a future version. To make the fire look like it's casting a bit of light onto the ground, I'm going to use a tool really similar to VFX Shadow, which is VFX Reflection. It has basically the exact same kind of controls. At first you may notice that your reflection is getting cut off here at the bottom. So I need to uncheck Clip to Bounding Box. It'll give me this little warning because sometimes a shadow or reflection can get really big compared to your layer size, so just be careful with it. Next I can make it this squat little reflection like that, and add some softness to it, changing the softness type to simple. So I get something that looks a little bit like cast light, reacting to exactly what's happening in the footage. And honestly, we're pretty much ready to move into Supercomp at this point. I'll apply a color correction preset I saved from my previous shot called Woods. I'll make sure that my fire layer is set as an additive blending mode and apply the big fire preset to it. And then on my lady in the foreground, I'm actually going to apply 2 instances of light wrap. One that's tight and a little bit brighter, and one that's a little bit more softened and subtler. I'll also add a touch of edge blend. And I think I'm going to erode her edge a little bit because she comes in pretty sharp. Just like in my previous shot, I'm going to bring in a foreground fog asset, which once I drag into the layer stack, I can just click over here on this plus button and it throws it into Supercomp along with everything else. And then, using some of my nifty Fractal skills from the Captain Marvel episode, I'm going to create kind of this distorted column of smoke of sorts, just to enhance the area a bit. Over the next few minutes, I kind of jump back and forth between layers and balance this out, balance that out, until I really like how the final comp is coming together. And just to give you a reference again, these are the input layers that I'm throwing into Supercomp, and here's my output. Once I've got these 2 things rendered, you can see how they play back to back. In our promos that we made for Supercomp, I even played with this and added a little animated mask to convert the fire from yellowy to bluish. And that one simple change in my fire pre-comp affected the glows and everything appearing in this version of the shot. Now, neither of these shots are mind-blowing from the VFX standpoint, and we'll definitely hit some more complicated stuff during this Game of Thrones series. But one of the things that I hope you learned from these examples was how quick and intuitive Supercomp can feel when applying to a shot using raw materials like this and outputting a final shot like that. But honestly, one of the best parts of integrating Supercomp into your workflow is that you can shop through final looks really quickly. You can browse through different presets and get some really wonderful results using super simple ingredients, as it were, to go into your shot. You don't have to add a series of 6 adjustment layers to see what a fire and its compound blur and its distortion map would look like. They're all applied right here, all together in one workspace. And since all of the transform keyframes are preserved in your layers below, it means you can work right in the comp that you're designing in anyway. So just like with the Game of Thrones series, we're going to start off simple and get more and more visually complex as we go through these. All of our more complicated shots going forward will springboard off of a lot of these simple concepts. Stay tuned for more of our Game of Thrones episodes, and if you haven't already, you should definitely go check out Seth Worley's Mind Flayer tutorial, and just watch that thing like 143 times. The dude's really good.